Et voila. Right, greetings, hello. Welcome to this week's Philosophy Club here in Betet. Sunday, and it's the June. We've just had the D-Day landings celebrated 3 days ago. Today's the 9th of June. So I think I've said this before, but I'll just start with a few things this week. I nursed soldiers in the Canadian Army who'd fought in that battle, horrendous battle. And I've seen, Saving Private Ryan, which Spielberg recreates the action on the beach. I've been there. I've been to Memorial, which is a brilliant museum in Caen. And as a philosopher of peace, I'm utterly against wars. I was brought up to think that war was a just war and that the soldiers that fought in it were doing their duty. It was tragic. Many died. The pacifist position technically says, well, but you don't have to do it. You don't have to fight. And I've sort of wavered between absolute pacifism, all wars are wrong, never fight, kind of Tolstoy's position, and then the idea of, well, yeah, but in terrible conflicts, somebody's got to do it, so, you might have to. I escaped the problem personally as a Druid because we are sworn to non-violence. I'm not allowed to fight. I'm not in the army. I've never joined the army. And that includes military intelligence and all that stuff. I won't participate in killing. But I don't think I have the right to tell other people that they're not allowed to defend their homelands. So I don't think I've got the right to tell my Ukrainian friends, you must not fight, you must all be pacifists. I know Ukrainian pacifists and I respect them greatly. I wish there were more Russian pacifists. I believe in conscientious objection. I think if you don't want to be a soldier, you shouldn't be forced to. And I think there should be laws in every country allowing people not to fight, maybe providing civilian service and so on. The young Israeli boys that are having to fight in the IDF is tragic, and the same with the Hamas people. I think they're bullied psychologically into fighting, these youngsters. I'd like to say to them all, just, stop fighting. You don't have to participate in this. So there is place for active pacifism, I think. My friend in Glasgow, who helps run the Gandhi Foundation, he wrote a very interesting book about non-violent resistance against Hitler in the run-up to Hitler. Some peace activists refused to participate in violent resistance to Hitler, but tried non-violently. The Danish people as a whole did. So, I think we could be more creative in our use of applied non-violence. Gandhi was very strict on using non-violence to defeat the British and won. But unfortunately it led to the breakup of India and chaos and bifurcation, Pakistan, India and so on. So, there's a big discussion about all this. But anyway, I've been thinking about all this because of the D-Day celebrations, if that's the right word. The fact that the British Prime Minister didn't even stay for them properly and just went home to do a television interview tells us he's just a child of the media. I mean, I think he's too young to know anything about that conflict. And so many people today don't understand what a sacrifice that was. I know people who fought in it and whose parents fought in it, whose fathers did. It was a tragedy. I've also been active this week, obviously, in following the tragic events of the Middle East. One thing that upsets me, actually, is that the soldiers that fought in D-Day, in the British Army and the American and Canadian Army, and some French as well, and others, Poles and so on, were come to liberate Europe to get free of the Nazis, and they went on and liberated the concentration camps. One of my family friends, Herb Steinhaus, was involved with liberating some of those camps as a photographer. He was a Canadian, member of the Canadian Army, a Jewish specialist in the photography unit. They took loads of photographs and documented it. And later he worked helping set up UNESCO in Paris as a Canadian journalist, intellectual. And he met Oskar Schindler, who came to his office in Paris to tell his story about how he tried to liberate people from the Nazis in occupied Poland. And Herb Steinhaus tried to get that story out to the media, and none of the media were interested in it in 1947 or whenever it was, because they didn't want good news. It's the same problem we have now. It was only years later when Spielberg again made the movie Schindler's List that he went to interview Herb Steinhaus, and he told him the story. This is a problem. We need more good news, and yet the media outlets aren't interested in carrying it. I'd like these philosophy club talks to be like good news, but you won't see it on the mainstream news media because they want just, tragedy, terrorism, bombings, etc. We've had the election results in India this week, which I was involved with monitoring with a panel of experts. And I think there are questions about the results. One of my colleagues is challenging the veracity of them because of the electronic voting machines that are used. There's no way of knowing if they're actually true. It looks to me a bit too neat for Modi because he gets back into power, he stays Prime Minister, he can do what he wants. He has a slight denting because he has to now work with other parties. If I was trying to sort of fake the elections, this is the result I would have done. He knew he had to downsize a bit, but he hasn't downsized so much that he has to leave office. So there are still questions about the veracity of the results, and I think it's a problem shifting everyone to electronic voting when there's no way of checking on the results. And the group I'm part of was campaigning for a printed verification of your vote that you can take home. It was denied to them. In Germany, electronic voting machines have been outlawed because of these problems. They can be hacked. Any electronic software that's invented by man's intelligence can be hacked by other people. So, so there's that casts a sort of existential insecurity and not knowingness over the whole thing, which is unfortunate. But let's hope that he acts in a less autocratic way and stops jailing his opponents and misusing the powers of the Indian system. I also called as part of that panel for the equivalent to what we have in France. We have here in France a thing called the Constitutional Court. Because we have a written constitution in France, there's a court of elders who, if there's a problem and somebody is fiddling the constitution or going against the constitution, they're hauled up to the court. Even a prime minister is answerable to the constitutional court, and it includes all the former prime ministers of France still alive, and senior judges and real experts in constitutional law. In other words, no sitting serving prime minister is allowed to go against the constitution, and that's really good. Now they don't have that in India. What Modi has been doing for this last decade is flagrantly breaching the Indian constitution, which is a written document written by a great Indian patriot, Ambedkar, and I met his secretary, a man called Lakshmipati, who came to my office when I worked with the Gandhi Foundation in London, and he told me a bit about the story. Ambedkar became a Buddhist. He believed Buddhism was the best thing India had done for the world. He was a true intellectual, and Lakshmipati was as well, his secretary. Now this man Modi has been just completely ignoring it. It says in the constitution you're not allowed to canvass on religious grounds. Modi has been going around India saying, I'm the reincarnation of Rama, vote for me, waving the sort of, Bhagavad Gita and saying, if you vote for me, Hinduism's saved. I mean, he doesn't say, I am the reincarnation of Rama, but that's effectively what he's doing with the optics. He's going to all the Rama temples, and every other word he says is Rama, Rama. Well, which is all against the Constitution. And our panel complained to the Electoral Commission and completely ignored. We never even had a written reply from them, not once. And it's not just Modi, others of his RSS and which is the sort of Hindu stormtroopers that back him, that were doing the same, completely ignored. So I suggested, look, they're not playing by the rules. You need to copy what France does, which is have a constitutional court. And then these kinds of questions would be resolved, and they would have the authority to tick off serving prime ministers who are misusing the constitution. So yes, and other colleagues have made other suggestions. And it turns out that there are many countries in the world that have like a constitutional court, or sometimes they call it a constitutional council. I think it's a good idea, as we have in France. I think we should have it in the UK. I think it's long past the need for a written constitution in the UK. I support that, because the only reason Boris Johnson got away with his madness and his lying and deceit is because there's no written constitution. So he could turn around and say, I'm not breaking anything, I'm the Prime Minister, I can do what I want. Well, one of the first things in the written constitution would be outlawing lying in Parliament. Should be a constitutional faux pas. You're not allowed to lie in Parliament, and if you do, you get sacked. How can we have trust in politicians if they lie and deceive like Boris Johnson did, and others? So I'm looking to the coming elections to get rid of that shower and bring in some politicians of integrity in the UK. Unfortunately, we don't have electronic voting. We have actual written ballots. I don't think they can fiddle it so easily. And that's really important. And if we have if and when we get a written constitution in the UK, then we need a constitutional court or council to oversee and ensure that it's always adhered to by the people that are in politics at that point. It's important, this stuff. So thank you, India, for teaching us in the UK that because the reason India doesn't sort of take it seriously is because they think they can get away with it. And they look at Britain and they look at Boris Johnson and Brexit and say, we can get away with it too. That's why it was so wrong what the Tories did and Boris Johnson in using deceit to force down Brexit, which was only in the interests of the Russian intelligence apparatus led by Putin, as research has proved. And it was only in the interests of the super rich in the UK, people like Sunak, millionaires, billionaires, who don't want the ideas of a community which enables equality, solidarity, liberty, and so on to coexist. So. And one politician I listened to this week also is Rory Stewart, who was he stood as leader of the Conservative Party against Boris Johnson. He lost, tragically. He's been interviewed this last week, and he was saying a lot of sense. And he said, I know Boris Johnson was a very bad man and very deceitful, and I therefore stood against him. Rory Stewart is a wise guy. Who was MP for Cumbria. I actually have corresponded with him in the past, and he was totally against Brexit as well, and he was certainly against the hard Brexit that Boris Johnson wanted. He was for the minimum Brexit, like keeping in the single market, because he was intelligent enough to know that that's in the interests of Europe and in the interests of Britain. And he would know that because of it, Putin was able to invade Ukraine. It was part of Putin's game plan was to separate the UK off from the European Union, and then invade Ukraine was part of that. And putting Trump in the White House was part of Putin's game plan. Rory Stewart's dad was an very senior intelligence agent, so Rory Stewart grew up with MI6 background, and he would know what I'm talking about is true. But of course the corrupt system that put Boris Johnson in power didn't want him getting near the premiership, so it made sure he couldn't get into power, sadly. I think Rory would make a good, if Starmer's wise, he would appoint him Minister for rejoining the EU in a government in a couple of years' time. Because Rory's no longer a member of the Conservative Party. He resigned, he said they're corrupt, I won't serve with them. they've been ruined, and he could make a good minister to renegotiate entry back into the EU. That would be my advice to Keir Starmer, who I hope becomes the next Prime Minister. What else? Okay, I've been active with my World Peace Gardens project, still looking to gardens to, if we can't trust politicians, but we can trust flowers, plants, trees, gardens. Let's beautify the planet and get gardens for peace everywhere, as my friend Geoffrey Gale wanted. So we had some good conversations with someone with a garden in Norway, and also one in Pakistan who's wants to help with the World Peace Gardens Network and spread this idea in Pakistan, and has a rose garden in the middle of the Indus River Valley, which is now in Pakistan, and was the cradle of Hindustan, what we now call India. So that was exciting, and tragically, of course, the war in Gaza and Israel goes on. This is a nightmare. It's what I find so ridiculous is every time there's a sort of hint of maybe there's going to be a truce, maybe a ceasefire, maybe a peace deal will be signed, Israel steps up its bombardments. It's like they go into overdrive of killing as a killing machine, and it's like a psychological warfare game they play. They get the Palestinians to sort of tempt them with there's going to be a peace soon, and the Palestinians sort of come towards the table like a cat. You have to tempt them, and then they start bombing them even more than ever before. And so there have been some horrendous casualties this week. I find this just distasteful to my sense of ethics and morality. It's not the way to fight a war. It's not the war that should be being fought. And I've had some complicated and difficult discussions with colleagues of mine in Israel who are very defensive of what Israel's doing and saying, no, it's totally, we have to do this, we have to destroy Hamas. It's tragic, but yeah, we have to, and it's collateral damage is to be expected. Yes, well, my position is slightly different. I support Israel and I support Palestine simultaneously. I'm a believer in peace, I'm a believer in the two-state solution, and I think this whole tragedy should have been avoided by more intelligent peace diplomacy. When Rabin was Prime Minister of Israel, he negotiated the Oslo Peace Accords, and he was then assassinated by people from the hard right of Israeli politics. And Netanyahu capitalised on that murder and comes from the same stable that did the assassination. And they've seized power, I think, illegally, this extreme right faction of Israeli politics in the name of Likud. And their ideology is to never ever make a peace deal with the Palestinians, but to use violence and warfare and terror to really destroy them all, drive them from the land. And I find that utterly abhorrent to my sense of fair play. I was brought up to play cricket, and you stick to certain rules in warfare as well as in peace. Now Likud, ever since the beginning, have never stuck to the rules. They were founded by Menachem Begin, who was himself a terrorist, who came from Russia, and he was the brains behind the King David Hotel bombing, one of the brains, which they attacked the British army officers in this hotel and killed dozens of them. When the British were in the process of handing over power, we wanted to give it to Palestinians and Israelis, both, a dual state. And that was going to happen. And yet these fanatics decided to attack and kill the British at that point, when we were having liberated the camps, having defeated the Nazis. They then chose to attack us. I mean, I think that's unforgivable. And they also killed the Swedish UN representative who was trying to work out a peace treaty for Israel and Palestine. So these fanatical right-wing Israelis, why did they do that? Why were they so unrational or irrational? I don't know. I have many theories. Menachem Begin was arrested by the KGB. He was from Russia. he was imprisoned. One possibility is he was actually, and he then got out. What if he made a deal with Stalin's KGB people to go to Israel and cause mayhem? Stalin was certainly crafty enough to do that. And he might have said to Begin, look, we'll let you go. We won't talk to you. Just go back and, attack the British. That would have suited Stalin to cause mayhem in Palestine. Has anyone ever researched this? Has anyone interviewed the people that, anyone gone into the Soviet archives? It's a hypothesis I've got, because I can't see any other explanation why Israeli patriots would fight the British who were about to give them power and give them a state. But so, and that would explain, because it was that group, Likud, the Irgun lot and all that brought terrorism into the Middle East, that brought this idea that you can create something worthwhile by doing violence, mass violence. I don't agree with that. Ideologically, I think terrorism is a false teaching, and it was adopted by the Soviet system, by Stalin, and it was adopted by extreme left and extreme right. I don't agree with either use of terrorism. I've coined a counter word, which is joyism. I believe that we should have joyous manifestos, joyous manifestations to achieve worthwhile politics. And today in Europe, we're voting European-wide for the European Parliament. I hope joyous candidates get in. I know that Putin has tried to influence the vote to swing it to the hard right. He's pouring money into hard right parties like Marine Le Pen and their equivalents all over Europe in order to destroy Europe from within. I hope and believe that Europe is intelligent enough not to fall for that they'll vote for the ecology parties, the left-centre parties, and the kind of decent soul of Europe will come out of this. But certainly as an intellectual, I've always stood up for joyism against terrorism. So the reason I'm saying that about history is that if you look at what's going on in Gaza, you wind it back to the foundation of Likud and the Irgun and that whole thought movement. That this is where it winds up. They've been doing terrorism all along the line, and Netanyahu's simply the kind of window dressing on the face on the bombing and the carnage, which is unfortunate. And the International Criminal Court has rightly called him a war criminal who should face charges. His response is just to do more crimes. I mean, which is always the response of criminals. So, yes, I could say more about that all, but I'm gonna just approach it from another historical perspective, because the other thing I've been doing this week is reading Josephus, the author of Jewish Antiquities. I'm trying to understand. I mean, I've known many rabbis. I've been to synagogues many times. I've studied the Kabbalah. I sympathise with many aspects of the Jewish faith, and I've known many great Jewish intellectuals who've been my PhD advisors and my teachers and professors. I'm appalled. What I don't understand is why aren't they speaking out? The kind of intellectual liberal wing of Judaism. Where's that in Israel? When I go to Israel, they're the people I meet. They're the good people who surely they're appalled at what's been happening. So I'm just like, I'm tormented. Where's the conscience, the liberal conscience of Israel gone? It was never intended to be a state doing massacring of the local Palestinians. In its first period, when the British mandate was there and we allowed many Jews to come and settle, the idea was never to terrorise and fight the local Palestinians, but to live alongside them happily. And that was what Martin Buber and the first generation wanted. So I've just been doing some deep research into Jewish history, and reading Josephus's Antiquities is very, very instructive and frightening, because here's the book. If you haven't read it, I mean, and you've got a month or two, I'm using a talking book. It's 70 hours of conversation, which I'm following also in the text. What is so, I think, shocking about Josephus retells the Bible as a historian. So he tells it like a historical narrative in prose. The whole story of Moses, the Exodus, all the way down, the first patriarchs, the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, the settlement, the judges. On virtually every page of Josephus there are battles and wars and conflict. And even when you get to the kings, they're all doing fighting and killing of the enemy. There's always an enemy to go and fight and kill. And then if there isn't an external enemy, there's internal ones. So these kings of Israel are fighting amongst themselves. The son is attacking the father, the brother's attacking the other brother. Every page, and I'm not joking, is some kind of battle. And what's so interesting is that the text is always saying, and God decreed that such and such should win the battle. Or God said, go out and slaughter, and they went out and slaughtered. So the idea of God that comes through the pages of Josephus, and who was just being true to the biblical narrative, is actually quite a primitive understanding of God. My understanding of God is not a kind of war mascot that leads you into killing and slaughtering because they're other and they're the enemy. If we're going to talk about God at all, I would be talking about Newton's God, or Spinoza's God, or the God of Herbert of Cherbury, the God of the deists of the Enlightenment. That's the God I follow. And that's not a God of mass slaughter. What I think Josephus tells us, and what the Bible tells us, is that at that time, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, people thought like that. People thought it was okay to go and slaughter people if God was on your side. And I think that wasn't unusual, and I don't think it only happened among the Israeli tribes. I think that was pretty much a universal position taken by Homo sapiens around about 3, 4, 5,000 BC. From the records archaeologically, the people of Sumeria were fighting each other with their cities. Babylonians were fighting each other. In the Celtic world, they were fighting different tribes. In the Germanic world, different tribes were fighting. In fact, the first ever battlefield archaeologists have discovered in Europe is north of Berlin, about 60 miles north, where they were using stone axes and bronze little things, and they found horrendous number of casualties, bodies, skulls. It was a full-on battle, about 1500 BC. And archaeologists have announced this is the first battlefield they've discovered in Europe. So they were doing it here in Europe as well. So why then, why is the Bible so full of it? Well, and this is the interesting bit. The Bible is where writing in alphabetic script was first invented in that region. And I've got here a chart to show this, which comes from Israel, from Sepphoris when I visited there. And it's a brilliant chart. It shows the evolution of the alphabetic script. Right, so this is the Hebrew alphabet. These are the other forms. And the first one was the Phoenician, which was from the coastal regions. Phoenicia invented the idea of an alphabet. It went inland to the Hebrew tribes. It was about 1700 BC, first invented. And it spread. This is Proto-Canaanite, so the people of the region were using this alphabet. And the Giza calendar, 10th century BC. So it's because of that we have the text of the Bible, because that was invented in that region. So the people that wrote down these stories and these battles were the first ever in history to write these stories down. I've always said to my students that if the alphabet had been invented in northern Scotland, we'd all be reading a Bible about the early travails and sufferings of the early Celtic tribes of northern Scotland, who had their battles and their prophets and druids, just like the Hebrews did. And it was the same stuff, no doubt, rivalries of families fighting for hegemony and so on. And if you did it in the American Indian culture, let's say they invented the alphabet in North America in 1750 BC, we'd have a Bible of the American Indian tribes, or China or wherever. So I think it's a kind of, it's sort of an accident of history that we get the Middle Eastern tribal battle stories. The other part of the Antiquities that Josephus talks is the role of the prophets, because there's two narratives. There's the kings and the power brokers fighting all the time, doing battles against each other, rival kings, attacking Syria, Babylon, whatever. Horrendous slaughters. And then there's these prophets that come and weave between the narrative. And they've got a sort of ambivalent role. Sometimes they're saying to the kings, go for it, God's on your side, he will grant you the victory. And then they can also come and say, you didn't do right. God is taking away your charisma. You can no longer be a king. So the prophets have some sort of undescribed authority over the kings. Sometimes the kings listen, sometimes they don't. Isaiah, for instance, one of the great prophets, is sawn in half by one of the kings. If you offended a king in the wrong way as a prophet, they sometimes would kill you. And that's very similar in the Celtic world, only we call them Druids. The Druids were the equivalent to the prophets, and they were always trying to control the kings and the little tribal chiefs. And in the Druid world, by and large, they were respected. The Druids had authority over the warrior class. The kings were chosen from the warrior class, although sometimes they were Druids themselves. One of the first kings of Ireland, Olaf Fodla, about 900 BC, was a Druid and a king, and he initiated the Tara assemblies in Ireland, which was up until Christianization was the seat of kingship. The High King of Tara was the leading king of all the tribes, and the Druids would assemble there and recount the oral laws, because it was all oral. So keeping your word was absolutely essential to these traditions. So anyway, I'm reading it as a Druid. It's very interesting looking at Josephus and the utter tragedy of the whole thing, and how glibly God is wheeled in to bless all these massacres. And I'm just thinking, fast forward to what's going on in the IDF doing massacres in Gaza, and Hamas trying to massacre the Israelis back. They're both invoking this same idea of God as the one that sanctions warfare and violence, which I find wrong and just intellectually puerile. I don't think that is the purpose of the God idea. I think that's it's a false understanding of God, but we have to work with it because that's what people have, and we have to somehow try and elevate, our theological understanding. Now, Josephus lived at the time of Christ, so in his Antiquities he actually mentions Jesus. It gets a couple of paragraphs later on, in about 40 hours of listening from now, get there. But he didn't meet Jesus, he didn't know him, he didn't accept that he was anything other than just yet another wandering prophet who briefly said a few things and then was crucified. He doesn't seem to know anything about what we would call Christianity, which was an underground secret tradition at the time when Josephus was around. And Josephus was friends with the emperors, with Titus and Vespasian, so he was in the high court aristocratic circles of Rome and would not have therefore been privy to Christian ideas, which was a movement in the lower classes at the time.